"You're too dark to marry my son," his mother said. Then the family secret came out. The private dining room overlooked the Seoul skyline through tall glass windows washed in soft gold light. Crystal glasses shimmered beneath the chandelier. Expensive plates sat untouched on the table while quiet piano music floated through the restaurant like it belonged to another world. Amara kept both hands folded carefully in her lap. She had spent the whole evening trying not to look nervous. Across from her, Mrs. Han adjusted the sleeve of her cream silk jacket before lifting her wine glass halfway to her lips. Her smile never fully disappeared. "You're a beautiful girl," she said softly, almost kindly. "But my son cannot marry someone that dark. People would talk." The words landed gently. That somehow made them worse. For a second, nobody moved. Jun's face lost all color. His fingers tightened around the edge of the table, but no words came out. The other guests lowered their eyes toward their plates as if silence could protect them from what had just happened. Amara felt heat rise behind her eyes, but she refused to let the tears fall. Years of living far from home had taught her how to survive moments like this without breaking in public. Then, from across the room, an older man slowly looked up from his seat near the window. One of the waiters straightened immediately when he noticed him watching. The old man said nothing. But something in the room shifted. Amara Mensah had arrived in Korea 3 years earlier with 2 suitcases, a scholarship letter, and the kind of determination people only notice after it succeeds. During the day, she studied international business at Yonsei University. At night, she worked long hours at a small cafe near the river, smiling through tired feet and customers who rarely remembered her name. She spoke softly, listened carefully, and thanked people even when they ignored her. Jun Han noticed her anyway. He was the only son of the Han family, owners of one of the largest hotel companies in Seoul. People described him as calm and educated, but deep down, Jun still carried the weakness that came from growing up afraid to disappoint powerful people. Especially his mother. Mrs. Han moved through wealthy rooms like someone born to own them. Every word she spoke sounded polished. Every smile looked perfect from a distance. But beneath her elegance lived a cold belief that status mattered more than kindness. And tonight, she had made her opinion of Amara painfully clear. Near the corner window, the elderly man continued eating quietly alone. Most guests barely noticed him. But the restaurant staff bowed slightly whenever they passed his table. The old man watched everything. Especially Amara. Let's take a pause. Kindly subscribe to my channel and tell me in the comments section where you are listening from. Thank you. Dinner continued, but the warmth in the room had disappeared. The waiters moved carefully between the tables now, their polished shoes silent against the dark wooden floor. Even the soft piano music in the background felt distant, like something trying and failing to calm the tension hanging over the restaurant. Mrs. Han smiled as though nothing uncomfortable had happened. "So, she said, mispronouncing the name again while lifting a small spoon to stir her tea, "what exactly are you studying?" Amara opened her mouth politely. "International business." Mrs. Han nodded slowly. "Ah. That sounds impressive." She tilted her head slightly. "But is it a real graduate program? Or one of those exchange courses foreign students usually take?" Jun forced out a nervous laugh too quickly. "Mother, Amara has one of the top scores in her department." "Of course," Mrs. Han replied smoothly. "I only asked because Korean universities can be very difficult." Amara wrapped her fingers tighter around her water glass. The cold surface pressed against her palm, helping her stay calm. She had learned long ago that some insults were designed to leave no visible bruise. They arrived dressed as questions. As compliments. As concern. That was what made them dangerous. Across the table, one of the younger guests lowered his eyes and focused hard on cutting his steak into perfect squares. Beside him, a woman adjusted her necklace 3 times without speaking. Nobody wanted to enter the conversation. Mrs. Han took another sip of tea. Still, she continued, I admire your confidence. Amara looked up quietly. Confidence? Yes. Mrs. Han smiled again. It takes confidence to enter spaces that are very different from where you come from. The sentence settled heavily over the table. June shifted in his chair. Mother. What? She asked lightly. I'm being honest. Different cultures see relationships differently. Marriage is not always only about feelings. One of the waiters approached carefully to refill water glasses. He paused for half a second when he noticed Amara's expression. Not pity. Recognition. Like he had seen this kind of silence before. Mrs. Han noticed the waiter looking and gave a small wave of her fingers for him to leave. Then she turned back toward Amara. And life in Seoul must be expensive, she said gently. June has always been generous. I hope you are not carrying too much pressure financially. The meaning beneath the words was clear enough for everyone at the table to hear. Amara felt heat crawl slowly into her face, but she kept her voice steady. I take care of myself. Mrs. Han gave a soft hum, unconvinced. Near the corner window, the elderly man finally set down his chopsticks. For the first time that evening, he looked directly at Mrs. Han. And the waiter beside him immediately stood straighter. The conversation continued, but now every word seemed to arrive with careful weight. People smiled too quickly. Laughed too softly. Forks touched plates with quiet little sounds that somehow made the silence feel even larger. Amara noticed how nobody looked directly at her for very long anymore. Not after Mrs. Han spoke. It was a strange thing about wealthy rooms. People often believed cruelty disappeared if nobody reacted to it openly. As if silence could turn humiliation into good manners. Amara had learned that lesson early in Korea. So she kept her back straight. When the waiter returned with fresh tea, she thanked him softly in Korean. The young man blinked in surprise before bowing politely. It was a small moment, easy to miss. But the elderly man near the window noticed it immediately. He noticed many things. He noticed how Amara waited for others to begin eating first. How she listened without interrupting. How she smiled politely even after every insult. And he noticed Mrs. Han watching all of it with cold approval, like someone inspecting a product she had already decided not to buy. June tried to repair the mood several times. He spoke about school. Travel. Business trends. Anything that might pull the dinner away from danger. But every time the conversation softened, his mother quietly dragged it back. You said your parents still live in Ghana? Mrs. Han asked lightly. Amara nodded. My father does. And he supports your studies here? There was a short pause. My scholarship covers most of it. Most? Mrs. Han repeated gently. June shifted beside her. Amara works very hard. Yes, Mrs. Han said. I can imagine. The words sounded polite. The meaning underneath them did not. Across the table, one guest reached for his water glass but stopped halfway, clearly uncomfortable. Another woman fixed her eyes on the city lights outside the window as though the buildings had suddenly become fascinating. Nobody challenged Mrs. Han. That was how power worked in rooms like this. Not through shouting. Through permission. Through the quiet understanding that some people could wound others without consequence. Near the corner window, the old man slowly folded his napkin beside his plate. The old man said nothing. But twice during dinner, he stopped eating. The second time happened when Mrs. Han gave a soft laugh and said, Still, I suppose confidence is important for a woman living so far above her social background. June finally looked directly at his mother. That's enough. But even then, his voice lacked force. Amara noticed it. So did the old man. For a brief second, the older man's eyes rested on June with something close to disappointment. Then he looked back at Amara. And when one of the waiters accidentally brushed against her chair while passing, Amara turned immediately and smiled. "It's okay," she said softly before the waiter could apologize. The waiter bowed deeply in relief. Mrs. Han watched the exchange with thinly hidden disapproval. But the old man watched it very differently. By now, the tension at the table had spread through the restaurant like smoke. People noticed it even when they pretended not to. The young waitress assigned to the private room had become unusually careful with her hands. She checked each plate twice before placing it down. Her smile looked nervous now, thinner than before. Near the bar, one of the junior executives from the Han company kept loosening his tie every few minutes. He laughed whenever Mrs. Han spoke, but the sound always came half a second too late. Even the chef peeked once from the kitchen doors before disappearing again. Everyone understood what was happening. Nobody wanted to be the person who challenged it. That was the problem with power. The stronger it became, the quieter other people grew around it. Mrs. Han continued speaking calmly, almost elegantly, while Amara sat with both hands resting beside her untouched plate. "You must find Korean society very different, Mrs. Han said. Our families tend to value tradition very deeply." Amara nodded politely. "Every country has its values." "Of course." Mrs. Han smiled. "But some cultures blend more easily than others." Across the table, June rubbed his thumb against his glass over and over again. He looked like a man standing between two doors, afraid to choose either one. The elderly man near the window watched him carefully. Then the accident happened. The young waitress stepped forward to refill Amara's water glass, but her hand slipped slightly against the edge of the bottle. A stream of cold water splashed across the tablecloth and onto Amara's sleeve. The waitress froze in horror. I'm so sorry," she whispered quickly, bowing again and again. Before anyone else moved, Amara reached for the napkins beside her plate. "It's okay," she said softly. She stood immediately and helped blot the water before it spread farther across the table. The waitress looked close to tears. "I should clean it myself," the girl said quietly. Amara gave her a small reassuring smile. "Then let's clean it together." For the first time that evening, the waitress looked directly at her. Relief flooded her face. But across the table, Mrs. Han's expression hardened. "You really are comfortable around service workers," she said coldly. The sentence dropped into the room like a stone into still water. Nobody breathed. The junior executive looked down instantly. One guest shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Another reached for wine with shaky fingers. Near the kitchen doors, the chef stopped moving altogether. June closed his eyes briefly, like the words physically hurt him. Amara slowly placed the napkin back onto the table. She did not argue. That somehow made the moment even more painful. Near the window, the elderly man looked up again. This time, he did not hide the disappointment in his face. And for the first time all evening, Mrs. Han noticed him watching. The restaurant had become painfully quiet. Even the piano music seemed softer now, like the room itself was waiting for something bad to happen. Mrs. Han folded her hands neatly on the table and looked toward Amara with calm, practiced elegance. The kind wealthy people often used when they wanted cruelty to sound reasonable. "A family like ours has responsibilities," she said gently. "Marriage is not just love. Image matters." No one reacted. Not because they agreed. Because nobody at the table had enough courage to challenge her. June finally leaned forward. "Mother, please stop." But his voice came too late. And too weak. Mrs. Han turned toward him slowly. "You may think I am being harsh now, but one day you will understand." Then she looked back at Amara. "Children should resemble their family. Absolute silence followed. Not the normal silence of a dinner ending. This silence had weight. Across the table, one guest lowered his fork carefully onto his plate without making a sound. Another stared down into her wine glass as though she wished she could disappear into it. Near the kitchen doors, the young waitress stood frozen beside a tray she had forgotten to carry. Nobody moved. And in that terrible stillness, Amara finally understood something. She had never truly been invited there. Not really. This dinner had not been about welcoming her into the family. It had been about measuring her. Testing her. Deciding whether she deserved to exist beside them. And Mrs. Han had already made her decision long before Amara arrived. June reached for her hand beneath the table, but Amara gently pulled hers away first. Not angrily. Quietly. That hurt him more. For the first time that evening, shame fully appeared on his face. Because deep down, he knew the truth. Love was easy in private. But protection mattered in public. And he had failed her. Amara slowly placed her napkin beside her untouched plate. Her movements remained calm, but her fingers trembled slightly as she stood. The entire table watched her. Even Mrs. Han seemed surprised by how composed she looked. Amara bowed her head politely. "Thank you for dinner," she said softly. No bitterness. No shouting. That dignity made the room feel even smaller. She picked up her purse and turned toward the exit. As she walked away, several people lowered their eyes in quiet guilt. The young waitress looked close to tears. June half rose from his chair like he wanted to follow her, but fear held him in place for one more terrible second. Near the window, the elderly man watched Amara cross the room slowly beneath the warm golden lights. Then he reached for his glass of water at last. "Interesting," he said quietly. And this time, everyone heard him. The doors closed softly behind Amara. For several seconds, nobody at the table spoke. The silence no longer belonged to embarrassment alone. Something else had entered the room now. Something heavier. Mrs. Han adjusted the sleeve of her jacket again, though her movements were not as smooth as before. June finally stood. "I'm going after her." "You will sit down," Mrs. Han said calmly. Usually, that voice ended every argument immediately. But before June could respond, another sound interrupted the room. A chair slowly moved across the floor near the window. Every employee nearby straightened at once. The young waitress lowered her head deeply. Even the restaurant manager hurried forward so quickly that he nearly stumbled over himself. "Chairman Kong," the manager said nervously. "We did not know you were dining here tonight." Mrs. Han's face lost color. June turned immediately. The elderly man picked up his cane carefully and stood to his full height. Age had bent his shoulders slightly, but nothing about him felt weak. The room changed around him in the quiet way rooms change around real power. This was Kong Min-ho, founder of the Han Group. Majority shareholder of the company that carried the Han family name across half of Korea. And June's grandfather. Mrs. Han bowed quickly, shocked. "Father, I didn't realize." "You did not realize many things tonight," Chairman Kong interrupted gently. Nobody moved. The old man stepped closer to the table, his eyes calm but sharp. For years, people inside the company had feared those eyes more than shouting. Chairman Kong rarely raised his voice. He did not need to. Silence from him often carried more danger than anger from other men. His gaze moved slowly across the table before stopping on the empty chair where Amara had been sitting. Then he asked quietly, "Do you know what kind of woman apologized to the waitress tonight?" No one answered. Not June. Not the executives. Not even Mrs. Han. Chairman Kong looked toward the young waitress still standing near the wall with trembling hands. Then back toward the table. "The kind that builds families," he said softly. not destroys them. The word settled heavily into the room. Mrs. Han opened her mouth carefully. Father, I was only thinking about what is best for June and the family. Chairman Kong turned toward her slowly. And yet, he said, you never once asked what kind of woman she truly was. Mrs. Han lowered her eyes for the first time that evening. Across the table, the younger executive sat straighter now. The balance inside the room had shifted so quietly that nobody could point to the exact moment it happened. But everyone felt it. Power was moving. And for the first time all night, Mrs. Han no longer seemed like the most important person in the room. 2 nights later, the Grand Aurora Ballroom glowed beneath hundreds of golden lights. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling like frozen rain. Waiters moved carefully through the crowd carrying silver trays filled with champagne glasses while reporters gathered near the entrance beside giant white banners marked with the Han Group logo. Every important person in Seoul seemed to be there. Executives. Investors. Politicians. Media companies. Even celebrities. The annual Han Group Charity Gala was one of the most powerful social events in the country. An invitation alone could change careers. Mrs. Han stood near the center of the ballroom wearing a dark emerald dress covered in tiny diamonds that caught the light whenever she moved. From a distance, she looked calm again. But people who watched closely could see the tension hiding beneath her smile. She kept glancing toward Chairman Kong. And Chairman Kong had barely spoken to her all evening. June noticed it too. Since the dinner, his grandfather had ignored 3 of his phone calls and cancelled their usual breakfast meeting without explanation. The silence unsettled him more than anger would have. Something was happening. He simply did not know what. Then the ballroom doors opened again. Conversation across the room softened little by little. Amara stepped inside wearing a simple black gown that flowed softly around her shoulders. She looked elegant without trying to impress anyone. Calm. Controlled. But the shock spreading across the room had nothing to do with her dress. Mrs. Han's face tightened immediately. June stared openly. Because Amara was not supposed to be there. For one confused second, nobody moved. Then something even stranger happened. One of the senior executives from Han Group walked directly toward Amara with a respectful bow. Miss Mensah, he said warmly. We're honored you accepted the invitation. Another executive followed behind him moments later, shaking her hand carefully. Then another. And another. The room slowly began noticing. Mrs. Han's smile weakened slightly. Who invited her? She whispered sharply to her assistant. The assistant looked nervous. The invitation came directly from the chairman's office. Mrs. Han turned pale. Across the ballroom, reporters quietly began asking questions among themselves while guests stole curious glances toward Amara. June moved toward her carefully through the crowd. Amara, he said quietly when he finally reached her. I didn't know you were coming. Amara met his eyes politely. Neither did I, she admitted softly. Until yesterday. Before June could respond, the crowd suddenly shifted again. Chairman Kong had entered the ballroom. The conversations lowered almost immediately. And this time, instead of walking toward the executives or the investors waiting near the stage, he walked directly toward Amara. The ballroom grew quiet as Chairman Kong stopped beside Amara. Dozens of eyes followed him. Executives straightened their backs immediately. Reporters lowered their voices. Even the musicians near the stage seemed unsure whether to continue playing. Chairman Kong looked at Amara for a long moment before offering his arm gently. Walk with me, he said. Amara hesitated slightly, then nodded. Together, they moved toward the stage at the center of the ballroom while confusion spread across the crowd like a wave. Mrs. Han's face had gone completely still now. The dangerous kind of stillness people use when they are trying not to panic in public. June followed several steps behind, unable to understand what was happening anymore. Chairman Kong stepped onto the stage slowly and accepted the microphone from the event host. My family, he began calmly, has spent many years building business across the world. The ballroom listened carefully. 25 years ago, during one of the hardest periods in our company's history, Han Group nearly lost its expansion project in Ghana. Several executives exchanged surprised looks. Most younger employees had never heard this story before. Chairman Kong turned toward Amara. At that time, many people closed their doors to us. But one woman did not. He paused. Her name was Adwoa Mensah. Amara lowered her eyes quietly at the sound of her mother's name. She helped our company when failure seemed certain, Chairman Kong continued. She translated for us, negotiated for us, protected us from corrupt deals, and opened doors nobody else could open. The room remained silent. She believed in our future before we believed in it ourselves. Near the front tables, several board members slowly began nodding in recognition now. Chairman Kong looked toward Amara again. This young woman is her daughter. A soft wave of shock moved across the ballroom. Mrs. Han's fingers tightened around her wine glass. Chairman Kong continued speaking. After her mother passed away, Miss Mensah continued building her own future with the same dignity, discipline, and intelligence. He reached into his jacket slowly and removed a thin folder. 3 months ago, Han Group received an anonymous international business proposal suggesting a new African development strategy. Now even June looked stunned. The proposal impressed our board so deeply that we began searching for the person who wrote it. Chairman Kong opened the folder carefully. It was hers. Complete silence filled the ballroom. Across the room, cameras slowly turned toward Amara. Executives who had ignored her earlier now looked at her very differently. Not with pity. With respect. Chairman Kang's eyes finally settled on Mrs. Han. His voice remained calm. But every word landed heavily. You were so busy measuring her skin, he said quietly, that you never noticed her worth. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Mrs. Han opened her mouth slightly, but no words came out. For the first time in many years, the most powerful woman in the room had nothing left to say. The silence inside the ballroom lasted several long seconds after Chairman Kong finished speaking. Then the room slowly changed. Not loudly. Quietly. Like a tide turning. Executives who had spent the evening standing beside Mrs. Han now began drifting toward other conversations. A few lowered their eyes when passing her table. Others suddenly seemed very interested in greeting Chairman Kong instead. Powerful people often moved this way during moments of public shame. Nobody wanted to stand too close to someone losing influence. Mrs. Han noticed it immediately. Her smile remained frozen in place, but the confidence behind it had disappeared. For the first time all evening, she looked alone. June stood a few feet away from Amara, struggling to meet her eyes. The truth hurt more now because it had become public. He loved her. But when she needed protection most, he had chosen silence first. And silence, he finally understood, could wound people too. I'm sorry, he said quietly. Amara looked at him for a moment. Not with anger. That would have been easier. Instead, there was sadness in her eyes. The kind that appears when someone realizes love alone is not always enough to make a person brave. I know, she answered softly. Across the ballroom, reporters continued whispering while executives approached Amara one after another, introducing themselves with sudden respect. But Amara did not look proud. She did not enjoy watching Mrs. Han struggle. That was not who she was. Real dignity rarely needs revenge. Chairman Kong stepped beside her once more. The old man studied her carefully, as though confirming something important to himself. Then he smiled slightly. Miss Mensah, he said, loud enough for the nearby executives to hear, will you consider working with us? The room grew still again. Not because people doubted her anymore. Because now they understood exactly how important the question was. Amara looked around the ballroom slowly. At the executives. At the reporters. At June. And finally at Chairman Khan. 3 nights earlier, she had sat at a dinner table where people looked through her as if she did not belong. Now the same room full of powerful people waited for her answer. But the moment was not satisfying because she had defeated someone. It mattered because, for the first time since arriving in Korea, someone had truly seen her. Not her skin. Not her background. Her worth. A small smile touched Amara's face. I would be honored, she said quietly. Chairman Kong nodded once, pleased. And somewhere near the back of the ballroom, the young waitress from the restaurant smiled too. Some people mistake silence for weakness. But dignity has a way of revealing who truly belongs in the room. Thank you for listening, kindly subscribe to my channel and follow for more interesting stories.